Good evening. So, if you're hearing a baby in the background, it is 4-month-old Fern, and I'm sure she wants to be on a video. So, this video is entitled A Better Kelp Farm, and that's what I'm trying to cover. So, I built a bunch of different revisions on kelp farms, and I mean, they've all kind of worked. This is by far the best, so I'm going to kind of walk through it. Obviously, kelp needs to be in water to grow, and it'll go quite a long height. And what you're trying to do is use pistons to break the kelp without breaking the bottom piece. So the next piece out from the bottom to break the kelp column, and use that kelp, float it out up here in such a way that you can gather it. And I see I have a piece stuck down there. We'll get to that. So what I'm doing here is like things in the water now float up to the top, whereas before they all used to sink, which the floating's pretty helpful. But how do you harvest it off the top once it's floating? Well, what I've done here is I'm using the floating concept to go up to some water, which is flowing. You can see the flow. And then I built this gap of signs. Now the signs keep the water out, so it creates an airspace in there. And then the kelp falls into this track and flows down to the hopper. Now, I don't have a trapdoor there, that's why that piece is stuck. But in theory, it should go in through this hopper and get collected by this chest. Yeah, we have a fair amount sitting there right now. So I built this just one-sided so that you could see the concept on the other side of how things kind of get put together. You can see that there's signs up here. That's what creates the air gap. You would plant your kelp in here once your water's in place, and this would be extended up. Now, one of the problems that I was having with kelp farms in general, in fact, farms in general, I see that a lot of people use observers to observe the kelp grow. So once the kelp hits a certain height, like up to 3, then the observer notices, hey, the kelp has grown up to 3, and then sends up a redstone pulse down to these pistons, which then break the kelp. But it seems like over and over and over and over again, the last piece to grow would be the piece right in front of the observer. Now, on a survival world, you're also very limited in resources. So it's not like you have enough resources to put an observer on every single column. I've seen that done, but maybe that's for like a very advanced player that has been in the game for a while. So I'm just using a single observer, but I'm not observing the kelp itself. What I'm observing is just a good old daylight sensor. Now something weird is happening with these daylight sensors, and you've already seen this a few times in this video, that this is harvested even though it wasn't dark out. It was broad daylight. So what I'm thinking perhaps is that when clouds pass over, it's changing, making this daylight sensor change somehow, and the observer is observing that and sending out a pulse. So it seems to be a very random pulse. It's somewhere between, I don't know, maybe 20 seconds and a minute long. But that's just perfect because kelp isn't reaching very high heights. Like the highest I've seen it is maybe 4 blocks, or 4 blocks tall before it gets harvested. So that's perfect. You want to keep it mowed down as short as possible and just have this just cranking. Now you could use a hopper clock instead of this, but I wanted this nice long, somewhat variable delay. And for resources, we're talking about 3 pieces of quartz and 1 piece of quartz plus some other stuff, a little bit of redstone, and your pistons, and you've got a working system, as opposed to observers on every single slot. Now this system can also be easily expanded. It can be expanded lengthwise. It can also be expanded height-wise. Now what you would do is just build another bank, another pretty much identical thing above this, and then have more signs above that, so that the kelp would drop down into that hollow spot, flow through that, drop down into that hollow spot, and flow out of the system. One thing that is important is that this block here be here. Otherwise, for whatever reason, the kelp gets stuck sometimes. Let's see if we can see that went right down. What would happen if this block wasn't there is that the kelp would get stuck right about there. for whatever reason and just kind of hover there. It doesn't happen every time, but it happens enough times to be annoying, and you wind up with some losses. So just add this column. Yeah, there you go. You just saw one go through. Awesome. This column of blocks so that way that doesn't happen, and it's a lossless system. Now, there is a little bit of loss taking place, so we're going to correct that right now. We'll just get a trapdoor and grab it, go down here, and let's place it right on top of this chest. So I have to shift click it. There we go. Now the kelp will stop flowing over top and onto that chest instead of being collected by the hopper. So every piece will be collected. All right, so what do you use kelp for? Well, kelp systems are good because you can make fuel. You can also eat dried kelp. So this is an example of how I might not just collect the kelp, but also process it. Now, this lever I just put on here as a temporary measure to keep the system from working. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that lever on, and now the system's fired up. The kelp would flow down here. It would get collected by these 3 hoppers. Boom, boom, boom. Which then, in turn, feed into 3 furnaces. We only have 1 bank loaded. That's just for, for demonstration purposes. So here we go. Okay, so you can see that the kelp has been collected. It's feeding into this furnace, and it's being smelted. It then goes down into this hopper. You saw a piece go through, and it gets collected by this chest. Now, for an XP farm, which kelp is not the best for an XP farm, but hey, I mean, any XP that you can get your hands on is good. The way to collect the XP is you have to let this chest completely fill up, and you have to let this hopper completely fill up, and then the furnace, it at least has to have 1 piece in it, standing there, not flowing through. When you take that piece of kelp out, that's when you get the XP from this hopper and from this chest all at once. So it's like 4 levels, or perhaps even better. Yeah, so trying to collect, you don't want to like open this up and take this out, because what happens is you're not collecting the XP from it. And even putting it back, you won't get the XP from it. Okay, right, you wouldn't want to take the piece out too early, because otherwise you won't collect the XP from it. So you have to let the furnace fill up before collecting the pieces from down below. The piece from the furnace is what gives you the XP. So once this system is filled up, the furnace would eventually go out once it's got 64 pieces of dried kelp here. And then you could just take that, and then you have to empty what's down below. So I would go in here, I would empty these out, and then I would process that into kelp blocks, which look like this. Now, the dried kelp blocks can then be used as fuel. So in this situation, what you want to have is a hopper either on the front, the back, or the side. In this case, I have it on the front, full of fuel. That's what's fueling this furnace. So what you want smelted comes in through the top. Your what its finished product comes out the bottom, and your fuel goes in the front. Now, once you get a big fuel load, you have smelted a whole bunch of fuel. What can you use the dried kelp blocks for? Well, you can use that for another XP farm. You could be using it for cactus, or even better yet, like chicken, something like that with higher XP, more bang for your buck kind of deal. Also, I wanted to kind of cover this. How do you move? This is fairly common knowledge among Minecrafters, but maybe you don't know this. So, how do you move an item a ways across flat? Because the water only goes 8 blocks. Well, what you use is ice and a sign. So you, at the end of where your water goes, chop that out, put a piece of ice in, put a sign above it. The sign then keeps this water from trying to backflow. So if the sign weren't there, you see how the item would just kind of get stuck there. Well, with the sign there, the item is able to flow down this all the way, and then slide across the ice and flow down this all the way. Which means you can transport that kelp from your kelp gathering system over to your smelting system, even if it's quite a long ways away. All right, I think that covers this. Thank you for watching, and have a very good night.